Indo-US environmental connections and concerns. Most of it, in fact, was covered today morning by Anupama. So my task has been actually quite limited in the afternoon session, the post-lunch session. So what I try to do, I try to explore the past, the present, and possible future of environmental connection between these two major democracies, with specific reference to climate change, which is perhaps the most significant negotiation of 21st century. While divisions do exist on climate change negotiation, it strangely has the potential of bringing nations together, as the issue is connected with the very survival of the planet Earth. Climate change cuts across national barriers, and it is not just a bilateral issue between India and the United States. It's in that sense multilateral, including all the nations. And the effect is global, though the cause could be regional. So in the sense, if there is a war in Afghanistan, so its effect could be felt in Himalayan glaciers. So there could be acid rain in India. So in that sense, it cuts across national barriers, even though the cause could be regional, but the effect could be global. And hence, it has the potential of bringing all the nations together, including India and the United States. Ramchandra Guha, he identifies evolution of three philosophical streams in environmental thought with the beginning of Industrial Revolution. One is, the first one, back to the soil, scientific management and wilderness principle, and observes environmental movement as the progeny of the 1960s in its complete form. While 1962 book Silent Spring of Rachel Carson is considered to be the harbinger of environmental movement in the United States, the 1973 Chipko movement was the beginning of such an awareness in India in modern times. While we can trace some similarity between thoughts of Henry David Thoreau and Mahatma Gandhi, we can also trace certain similarities between environmental regulations implemented in the US and India, and one such example is the National Park Law. Let me quickly give you a historical overview of climate change negotiations. What happens after 1962? In 1965, the US panel warns that greenhouse effect is a matter of serious concern. In 1975, US scientist Wallace Broker introduces the term global warming into public domain as a title of a scientific paper. In 1988, UN sets up Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change to collate and analyze evidence on global warming. In 1992, the UN Earth Summit creates Framework Convention on Climate Change, and developed countries agree to cut emissions. In 1997, the Kyoto Protocol sets binding targets for industrialized nations to reduce emissions by 5% against 1990 levels over 2008 to 2012. In 2001, US President George Bush removes US from Kyoto process. In 2005, the Kyoto Protocol comes into force. In 2006, China overtakes the US as the world's biggest carbon dioxide emitter, but the US remains well ahead on per capita basis. However, perhaps the most important symbolic event happens in 2009 when Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change IPCC, headed by an Indian R.K. Pachauri and American Vice President Al Gore, share the Nobel Prize for Peace for their efforts to spread awareness on climate change. The IPCC drawing on 2,500 scientists worldwide, confirmed in 2007 itself that temperatures will rise by 1.1 to 6.4 degrees Celsius and sea levels by 7 to 23 inches by the end of this century. And this is very likely caused by human activities. A sharp rise in sea level would have considerable impact on India. The United Nations Environment Programme included India among 27 countries which are most vulnerable to sea level rise. About a quarter of India's population lives within 50 kilometers of the coastline, Manipal included. The mega cities with huge population and infrastructure are on the coast. Much of the coastal region has fertile agricultural land, and there is every possibility that low-level areas in Orissa, West Bengal are vulnerable to inundation, possibility of salt water entering into groundwater, possibility of cyclone, all according to the studies conducted by different research agencies, including National Institute of Oceanography, GOA. With regard to the US, according to a survey, this is an interesting piece of information. According to Ramchandra Guha's book, once again, nearly 2/3 of US public seek stricter environmental laws. They are willing to pay more tax from their pocket. The green issues influence the electoral politics. Both Republicans and Democrats are trying to project themselves as more eco-friendly. But as a contrast, R.K. Pachauri observes, after Copenhagen's summit, he writes, the power of skeptics has become extremely high because economic interests which resist change support them on a substantial scale. About 770 companies hired an estimated 2,300 lobbies to influence federal policy on climate change. That means 4 climate lobbies for every member of the US Congress. So with regard to the negotiation between developed countries and developing countries, particularly between US and India, there is an interesting paper published by a noted climate change scholar, Benito Muller, of the Oxford University. So the paper places India at the very bottom of the list of countries assessed to be morally responsible for the problem, using, interestingly, Aristotle's logical framework. And according to this framework and analysis, because it takes emission into consideration since 1890, because these greenhouse gases, so they have the ability to rather have their effect for a long time. So data has been collected since 1890. So according to this data, the US contribution is the historical contribution to greenhouse gases. US contribution is 19.7%, European Union 14.8%, China 10.8%, Russia 6.5%, and India 3.9%. But this Aristotle's paradigm that is used by the scholar, it takes certain factors like harmless emission, subsistence allowance, etc. into consideration, and hence taking this basic allowance and harmless effect into consideration, the US contribution reaches 25.6%, EU 15.9%, and Indian contribution is reduced to 0.3%. However, US has committed in 2009 Copenhagen Climate Conference to reduce carbon emission to 17% below 2005 level by 2020, 42% by 2030, etc. But the Obama administration has shifted from its original unconditional stand of technology transfer to one based on innovation and investment in clean energy to favor Western companies is one of the observations. However, the last conference in Peru, 2014, December, the final text of the conference, it does underscore its commitment to reaching an ambitious agreement in 2015 in the conference due in Paris that reflects the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. So my position with regard to the entire climate change negotiation that has been happening over the years between different countries, including United States and India. The bone of contention is whose responsibility is this reduction of carbon dioxide or greenhouse gas emission. Whether the developed countries should take the responsibility or whether the developing countries should take the responsibilities. Developed countries, they try to put the blame on developing countries. They also maintain, of course, John Kerry also made it very clear that developing countries also have the responsibility, both China and India, so they are also large emitters of these greenhouse gases and they should also bring down the emission. But the position of the developing countries is because historically developed countries have already emitted and have been emitting the hazardous gases. It is their responsibility because the developing countries also should yet to meet the requirement of equity. They should yet to elevate poverty. They should yet to solve their economic problems, and hence they need to be exempted from this, and developed countries need to take the responsibility. So the negotiations actually stand at this point, and there is no much progress in this direction. My position is, in fact, both developed countries and developing countries need to take this responsibility. Even though historically developed countries have contributed a lot, so at this point we also need to experiment with alternative paradigms of development, because there is no point in replicating the same development model that is being followed in so-called developed countries. So it's a great opportunity for developing countries to experiment with less energy intensive, more decentralized development paradigms, because if the entire population of China and India put together replicate the development model or the standard of living of the developed countries, as many ecologists have observed, the resources of the earth will get over in a few days. So there is a need to experiment with alternative paradigms of development. Could be non-conventional sources of energy, could be other ways of life, other sources of energy, and hence both developed and developing countries need to take the responsibility of reducing the emission of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. So this is my position after making a review of several developments which have happened over the years vis-a-vis India and United States and climate change. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir, for sticking to your time and